In the Shadows of the Deep State, A Century of Council on Foreign Relations Scheming for World Government by Arthur R. Thompson. Published by Western Islands. Narrated by Daniel Natal. Foreword. The world is awash with problems, and the United States is no different. Many people are asking the question as to why we have seen the United States heading in the direction it has been. When enough people ask questions regarding just about any issue of the day, we see solutions being offered that often make matters worse. Too often, these solutions point to government as the answer. But is government the answer? Government solutions can also be a problem since they extend the reach and scope of government and build the power of government to the detriment of the individual and local community, and particularly of individual freedom. What most have not realized until recently is that what appeared to be spontaneous suggestions for more government are actually an agenda being implemented by a concerted, organized group to bring about socialism, not only in America, but around the world. Herein, we confirm that there is such an agenda. We shall touch on those behind this agenda, since just recognizing the agenda is not enough. It is important to expose those who are behind it in order to stop the march toward socialism. We will show that one of the key organizations that has been in the forefront of implementing it is the Council on Foreign Relations, CFR. We start this book based on the idea that knowledge is power. With knowledge comes the power to remain a free people. Every country that yields to totalitarianism does so because the people lack the knowledge to thwart the designs of evil men. We hope this book will add to your knowledge of what has been happening right before your eyes, and that your eyes will be open to the dangers of continuing down the path our country has been on for the past several decades. This book will not document in excruciating detail every aspect of what is discussed. The objective will be to point out that in every case, members of the Council on Foreign Relations and those who orbit around the CFR have been in charge or influenced the outcome. For those who wish to explore the problems in more depth, we shall offer suggestions from time to time indicating where the reader may go for more detailed information or to verify what we point out. The CFR is the prime organization that today constitutes what has become known as the swamp or deep state. More often than not, CFR members have been one or two layers down from the public image of government, financial institutions, and academia, where the public does not notice them or even have any knowledge of them. We will demonstrate this over and over again. We shall demonstrate the influence of the CFR to such an extent that it reminds one of what James Madison, the fourth president, said in the Federalist Papers. The accumulation of all powers, legislative, executive, and judiciary, in the same hands, whether of one, a few, or many, and whether hereditary, self-appointed, or elected, may justly be pronounced the very definition of tyranny. Our intent is not to teach history as much as it is to show how history has been made by a select few behind a curtain of deceit. You may know certain facts are false, so isn't it possible that other facts are false as well? Herein, you will learn of facts generally unknown. Quote-unquote history is based upon what is reported as news, so the same deep state that controls the news also controls history. There will be times that we are repetitious in order to make a point, and be reminded of that point since it is so important that we understand it and retain it in our thinking as we go forward. This will help the reader to remember these points as they read, hear, or see the daily news. An international slant is involved in nearly every solution proposed today, although the connection is not well known. It is a hidden bond. We shall bring this connection forward as we progress. Our country was founded on the principles of liberty which had been ingrained in the American people prior to the War for Independence. Had they not been ingrained, there never would have been an American resistance to the tyranny imposed by the British Empire. Many of these principles have been lost today in the education most Americans receive, even in private education. This handicaps the ability of those who have only had an education in the public sector, particularly to even begin to understand that some things were forbidden by the Constitution or American habits within the ethical basis of our society. The truth be told, the onerous direction from England at that time was in many ways petty compared to what our government is doing today, yet Americans tolerate it. To see why globalism is not a remedy to our country's problems, look at the proliferation of foreign entanglements that are a prime ingredient of the internationalist agenda. These treaties and trade agreements bind our economy into international commissions and organizations rather than leaving our country free to make its own decisions within a free economy. Once a country loses control over its own economy, that country is no longer independent or able to make major political decisions by itself. Our country's founders understood this principle. It was one of the main principles for which they fought England, to control our own economy. George Washington said in 1796, quote, "'Tis our true policy to steer clear of permanent alliances with any portion of the foreign world." End quote. Thomas Jefferson said in 1799, quote, "Commerce with all nations, alliance with none, should be our motto." End quote. And in 1801 he said, quote, "I deem the essential principles of our government, peace, commerce, and honest friendship with all nations, entangling alliances with none." End quote. These wise words of our past presidents and founders, as well as those of many more early American leaders, are forgotten today in the quest for international alliances, whether for military purposes or trade. The purpose of government is first to maintain our independence, and second, to protect our God-given rights of life, liberty, and property. Property? Yes, and if you don't understand this, return to where you received your education and ask for your money back. As President Calvin Coolidge said, quote, "Ultimately, property rights and personal rights are the same thing." End quote. The majority of people do not want the solutions to the problems of our day that seem to be being proposed, especially socialist solutions. Yet socialism marches on, and with it, the power of the state, which abrogates the above rights. The basic reasons for this are a lack of education, understanding, if you will, about the nature of the problems and therefore the real solutions. A second reason is that many do not want to assume the responsibility in their own lives that comes with implementing the correct solutions. Let someone else deal with the problems. In addition to the lack of responsibility to carry out the correct solution, even when the correct solution is recognized, there is the lack of will or organization to carry it forward. What do we mean? First, for example, if government supplies a seeming remedy and the people get used to the government taking care of the problem, even if there are other problems that loom as a result, few want to go back to the way things were originally because they would have to assume the responsibility themselves rather than government. Socialists understand this aspect of human nature and capitalize on it all the time. This process takes power away from the people and places it in the hands of government. We have to always remember the admonition of British Lord Acton. Power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. In addition, those who brandish power rarely relinquish it voluntarily. The most notable exception was George Washington, who willingly gave up power twice, once as Commander-in-Chief and again as President of the United States. The father of our country also refused to be considered as King of America when it was suggested. Washington set the example for future leaders. Second, a correct solution requires not only the desire to assume the responsibility for oneself, but also the ability to organize others to share the responsibility. So not only is there the need for individual responsibility for the solution, but the willingness to take on responsibility for the entire community. Few will ever do that, and fewer still will bring about the correct solutions that embody liberty rather than more government. However, it has been done in the past and continues to be done on a small but growing scale. Let us ask the question as to whether government solutions have solved a problem or made it worse. What federal agency has ever solved the problem for which it was created to solve? As examples, the problems of drugs, poverty, and terrorism have all grown under the so-called wars against them. The drug problem has grown, although one could rightly assume that all of the government manpower and money would have curtailed it at least, if not eliminated it. Statistically, poverty has grown according to the government tasked with eliminating it. And in spite of all the resources poured into fighting terrorism since 9/11, this too has grown, not only here, but all around the world. Recent changes by the Trump administration may change the course of the wars listed above, but what about the next administration? And do not think for a moment that there are not swamp people within the Trump administration, or that previous government officials that fit this description are being purged from the government in the numbers necessary to change things enough not to be concerned. What problem has not grown the breadth and reach of government? And what agency that was created by government to solve a problem has not kept on growing? In other words, the size of government has grown, and the question is whether the Constitution allowed for that growth and reach, as good as the motives may have been. A good example that impacts every family is Social Security. In the middle of the Great Depression of the 1930s, many people were destitute, especially the elderly, many of whom could not get work to put food on the table. A government pension was proposed. Individuals would pay into this, and at a certain age would draw back from the government what monies they had saved. When the system first started, Many initially drew monies they never paid into it and were thus able to survive. The people were told that the system would make up for this deficit as time went by. It sounded good enough to gain the support of the people for a program never authorized by the Constitution since the need was there. There seemed no other solution. There were real solutions, but these were not allowed to proceed for reasons we shall relate further on in the chapter about the Depression. The government supplied a service that was just adequate enough to get by. The cost in taxes was and is enormous to both individuals and their employers. The government took on a burden that will ultimately bankrupt the nation because eventually, even a very heavy taxation will not meet the financial need. This is what has been happening, and every true observer knows that this entitlement will ultimately bankrupt the nation. It is unsustainable. To make matters worse, the government did not put the money taken for the retirement program into a trust or fund. It was used up for government projects just as any other tax. It was never invested as other retirement programs or even banked for future use. Over time, the payments to retirees overtook the amount taxed, and this began to grow the national debt. The Communist Manifesto outlined this type of situation in a paragraph that few really understand if they only read it once. Just before outlining the 10 steps necessary for communizing a country, Marx and Engels said this in the manifesto, quote, "Of course, in the beginning, this cannot be effected except by means of despotic inroads on the rights of property and on the conditions of bourgeois production. By means of measures, therefore, which appear economically insufficient and untenable, but which in the course of the movement outstrip themselves, necessitate further inroads upon the old social order, and are unavoidable as a means of entirely revolutionizing the mode of production." End quote. While Marx and Engels were talking about the industrial side of this phenomenon, it holds up for any aspect of society. Substitute the words that deal with industry, such as the mode of production, and insert the idea of society, and you understand the strategy of the socialists. Marx and Engels understood that what was needed was a social revolution. In the Communist Manifesto, they stated they, the communists, openly declare that their ends can be attained only by the forcible overthrow of all existing social conditions. In other words, communism was not so much an armed insurrection as much as it was changing and revolutionizing society. Measures to accomplish this may seem insufficient at first, but those who have studied how others have subverted their governments over the ages know that some measures that make people dependent on government will ultimately garner increasing support, even among the best of libertarians. Indeed, the 10 steps outlined in the manifesto to communize a country deal with issues that change a society as much as they change government. Continuing the example of Social Security, once people rely on it, most drop their individual responsibility, do not prepare with any other retirement plan, and fear losing it regardless of the problems it presents for the financial future of the country. The individual problems that ensue as a result, due to a lack of a substantial personal retirement plan, start to affect the ability to pay their medical bills. The government solution becomes Medicare. Then others start to agitate for a more universal medical program from the government. After all, if one class of citizens receives such a program, why not all? This leads to such things as Medicaid and then Obamacare. Once people get used to the idea that such programs are their right, the agitation for such solutions never stops. Many people, due to these programs and those who promote them propagandizing the people, have come to the belief that they are a right. Unless stopped, future politicians will use this for building even more government down the road. And keep this in mind. Reforming a bad idea is not a solution. In addition to the above programs, the elderly start to receive government benefits such as surplus cheese and food handouts from the federal government through their local county government. They also have rent subsidies in certain 55-plus facilities, and many qualify for SNAP, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, formerly known as food stamps, and so forth. It goes on, growing the dependency of a segment of society on the largesse and regulations of the federal government, sometimes dispensed through local government. Before you know it, the segment has become a formidable bloc in support of government socialism and dependency on the government for just about all of their sustenance. And they not only have become used to this condition, but as stated, they demand it as their right. In addition, a great deal of the dole system that is in play in the United States is run by the Social Security Administration. Visit any Social Security office, and you will probably see a lot of recipients that are not in their retirement years. So we see the expansion of a simple retirement program into something that, as Marx and Engels described it, in the course of things outstrips itself, making further inroads on the old social order. This was part of the plan from the beginning, to build a voting bloc overwhelmingly in support of more socialist programs, starting with the elderly and then incorporating younger citizens. We could use more examples, but Social Security is the most obvious and universal. Other means of implementing this scheme are the involving of businesses and farms in government programs, foreign entanglements, and other systems. Each of these would take a book to explain how it works against the commonweal of the American people, ultimately leading to their enslavement. The point is that what we are witnessing is the steady accumulation of power into the hands of the state through dependency on the state. No one can deny this, even if he does not recognize just how it is being done. We are seeing the growth of a totalitarian state, and it is being done so subtly that few notice it, and most have become accustomed to it. We will explain further in another chapter. The Constitution has been eroded and ignored, and the federal government has taken on responsibilities and power never granted to it, and best left to the people or local governments. But simply saying that it is the government doing this is inadequate for understanding what is truly behind this growth of socialism. We need to understand those who are doing it, and why. In addition, we are witnessing the steady surrender of American independence to international rule through a variety of treaties, agreements, and military adventures. It is not just the individual who is losing his liberty. The nation as a whole is steadily losing its ability to exercise its sovereignty. Footnote: the book International Merger by Foreign Entanglements by this author is a primer on how treaties, pacts, and agreements are used to destroy American independence and the Constitution. This has been planned out. It has been done before in countries around the world, and there is organization behind it, organization that deliberately wants to enslave the American people, and indeed the entire world, as we shall expand on in this book. Franklin Delano Roosevelt is purported to have said, "In politics, nothing happens by accident. If it happens, you can bet it was planned that way." If there is a plan, there have to be planners. We will demonstrate that there are planners and show just how they have been organizing the threads of the Lilliputians across the Gulliver of the American people. At first, some will dismiss the evidence. After a while, though, they will experience a paradigm shift in their vision and see for themselves the truth of the matter. They will do so in such a way that they will never again look at their newspaper or television in the same manner as they do today. It is like the child's picture of jungle foliage we are told contains the image of animals such as a lion, a tiger, and a giraffe. We cannot see them. We cannot see the forest for the trees, in this case the animals. After looking for a time, we start to see that maybe this is an eye, and yes, that is a nose. Soon, we see the entire head, and so it goes. Once the images are visible, we never lose sight of them again. We will expose the images in the forest so that you will see what is happening right in front of your eyes and who is doing it, and more importantly, how it can be stopped. Chapter 1: A Sea Change. In 2016, a sea change occurred within the body politic of America. Regardless of what a person may think of Donald Trump, he came to epitomize the anger and frustration of a sizable segment of the American people. This anger and frustration had been building for decades due to the education of millions of Americans, not in the schools, but in the homes and meeting rooms across America, as well as the internet, and it permeated out into our population like ripples on a pond. This education centered on something called Americanism, the uniqueness of America and our government. Once people began to see that our Constitution and fundamental laws were not being followed, indeed were being destroyed, they began to ask the question why, and by whom. Why would anyone want to destroy American liberty, and how would those doing so benefit from it? The truth is that America has been steadily marching toward socialism since the beginning of our nation. There has been a steady but subtle erosion of adherence to our Constitution, destroying the freedoms that it protects. Yet few people wanted this, and most opposed it. So why was it happening? It was happening because those who want socialism have always been organized, and those in opposition have not. Until the mid-20th century, those opposed to socialism had never been organized, at least not in an ongoing, permanent basis. In the tome To the Victor Go the Myths and Monuments, this problem is outlined for the first 100 years of our country's existence. It relates how a small coterie captured the intellectual centers and entered the halls of education to deliberately start to change American society into a system compatible with socialism. They did the same with publishing and newspapers. Another layer of society they captured was the historical societies, placing themselves into positions to control history itself, and thereby what was available to the public, schools, and even government. History began to be controlled rather than archived. By the end of the Civil War, and steadily for the rest of the 19th century, they consolidated their influence and expanded it into the leadership of the major industries and business associations that had grown across the country. As their hold on government grew, an establishment with a hold over politics grew simultaneously and became entrenched. In some circles, this was referred to as the establishment, sometimes as the military-industrial complex, and today, simply the swamp. While these terms existed, few people could articulate exactly what or who constituted this group. The people only knew that they held control over government, locked out dissent, and were moving us toward total government, even international government. To identify they as an organized entity would mean that this group could very well be defeated once identified. Without this identification, it is nearly impossible to defeat them. Thus, the media controlled by this group, as well as nearly every other sector of American society, spends a great deal of time and effort in creating the idea that there isn't any such group, and that the transition of our country from Americanism to totalitarianism is due to accident, mistakes, or the natural deterioration of civilization. A part of this idea is that anyone who believes otherwise is paranoid and not worth the time to read or listen to. Just listen to us, they say, who tell you that our nation's transition into totalitarianism is an accident, a mistake, the will of the people, or the march of history. It has become obvious to many that there are those who will do anything to prevent the exposure of establishment people in and out of government, which would lead to them being replaced with individuals who have the American people in mind instead of themselves and their power. For instance, those who wanted to rid the federal government of Soviet Russian agents in the 1950s today are vilified in school history books and television news programs. The vilification continues today with all manner of invectives against those who want full transparency and disclosure relative to a wide swath of scandals within government. Today, there are those in government and the media doing all that they can to prevent the removal from government of those who want to protect the growth of government and the totalitarian direction we have been taking. These people exist within Congress, the courts, and the media, and they work in concert. It is not an accident when government keeps moving in the same direction while at the same time the vast majority of the people do not want to move in that direction. Overall, the direction is one of control of the individual, business, and property, and control of the media who have the responsibility to inform the people. Over time, America has moved slowly from a free country to one where business and the individual cannot do anything without the permission of government. It has been done so gradually that people have become accustomed to it and rarely, if ever, think about it. For instance, you cannot buy a home without government permission by paying a tax. You cannot maintain or change that home without compliance with myriad government regulations, such as zoning laws, environmental regulations, and government standards regarding your home's electrical and plumbing systems, etc. At one time, purchasing a piece of property or a home meant a handshake and recording the deed at the county seat. Today, it requires thick piles of forms, real estate agents, brokers, and lawyers to comply with a mountain of laws concerning transfer of ownership and compliance with regulations and the taxes connected to the transaction. Question: what is the difference between being evicted for not paying your rent or being evicted for not paying your taxes? The answer is none. You think you own your property until you do not pay your taxes. You may own it, but the government controls it. And control has always been more important. You cannot own a car and drive it without government approval and licensing the car and yourself. The maintenance of the equipment, speed, traffic control, etc. is controlled. You cannot practice your profession or skill without a license, and sometimes even your fees are regulated. You cannot get married without government approval in the form of a marriage license. In some states, you are even medically tested to gain approval for a marriage license, and the marriage must be properly recorded with the government. At one time in this country, you were married by a pastor or a priest, and the marriage may have been recorded in the family Bible. That was it. It was not the business of government. It was your business, between you and God. In today's America, everyone must be registered with the government from birth. It is called a social security number, something that follows you all of your life and is used in nearly every aspect of your life to identify you and your activity with the government. Originally, your social security number was not valid for identification, and it stated so on your card. You applied for a social security number upon employment. It was simply a number to identify your retirement account. Slowly, it began to take on a more important role, where today it is your government identification number and is required on nearly every document pertaining to your life, money, and property, the epitome of control stemming from a system that was originally sold as a retirement program. With the advance of new technology, the government now has the ability to monitor all electronic communication between individuals. While they may not actively monitor all communications, they do store all communications, just in case. We have been personally told by congressmen that in hearings pertaining to the use of these stored communications, the federal bureaucrats see no need to get a warrant prior to surfing them for whatever purpose they see fit. While these congressmen see a problem with this in regard to the Bill of Rights, specifically the Fourth Amendment, their congressional leadership does not. Let us go back to the subject of Social Security in regard to all of the above. At one time in this country, it was easier to subsist in old age because the taxes were low on property and everything else. Zoning laws were not in use to force people to maintain a standard of living that meant keeping up with the Joneses. We could expand on this theme, but the bottom line is that it is impossible to maintain a standard today below that which is now required by over a century of government growth and intrusion in taxes and regulations. Today, it costs a great deal of money to just be, to live, to exist, that it did not take 100 years ago due to the growth of government regulation and taxation. We could go on, but you get the point. How did we go from total freedom, doing as you please as long as it didn't violate the rights of others, to total monitoring and control, yet think nothing of it? How did we go from virtually no taxes to taxes on everything? It is not that long of a story. It is a simple one, but one that Americans have been educated to reject out of hand, even though they know that they exist. Americans have seen that in other countries there have been small groups of megalomaniacs who wanted to rule the people, and in some cases succeeded, often leading to war. Americans have had a difficult time believing the same thing could happen here. It can't happen in America, we're different, has long been the idea of most people. Nonetheless, it is now obvious that we're headed in that direction, and people are beginning to ask why, how, and more importantly, who is causing it. The who is less obvious here than in other countries, simply because there is no visible leader standing before the people and advocating for more government. Nor is there an obviously totalitarian political party that has a large following in the United States for that matter. The movement toward the total state has been slow because the education of Americans has until recently been superior, as well as the fact that Americans have had layers of strength within our society against the role of centralized government. This has made the march toward socialism difficult for those who wish to rule, no matter how much they may be in control of various aspects of American society. These layers of strength, so helpful for Americans, have never existed in their entirety within other societies around the world, and this has been their downfall in opposing their particular megalomaniacs. And this has set the American system and society apart from the rest of the world, to serve as an example to the rest of the world. Regrettably, rather than preserving these layers of strength, we have adopted too much of the systems of the rest of the world. Society determines the form of government it desires. No one understood this better than Karl Marx. He stated that what communists wanted was a social revolution, since only by changing society could a communist revolution be successful. Quote, they, the communists, openly declare that their ends can be attained only by the forcible overthrow of all existing social conditions. End quote. The Communist Manifesto. As a result, the minions of socialism and communism set out to change American society with the end in mind of altering our society into the acceptance, even the demand for, the total state. We see by the aforementioned examples that we are well on the way toward that end. One of the primary layers of strength among Americans was that they practiced their religion, and they lived their faith. They were not members of any particular sect, but applied a Judeo-Christian morality to business and government, as well as their family lives. Along with this was a tolerance for religious differences. Many had come to our shores to escape the religious prejudices that had led to bloody conflicts in Europe, and they did not want the same poisonous atmosphere to develop here. Religious prejudice did exist in America, but so did tolerance. As a result, men of all Judeo-Christian sects worked together to form the United States. Generally speaking, this unity has been the case ever since, with minor disturbances from time to time. These disturbances, however, were never of a national nature and were localized. Another layer of strength was a working knowledge among the general population of the Constitution and the rights of the people. One of the better-known studies of the American people and their politics in this regard was done by the Frenchman Alexis de Tocqueville in Democracy in America. De Tocqueville pointed out that nearly all Americans understood the Constitution and applied religious beliefs in their daily lives, including their view of the proper role of government. He claimed that this was what separated Americans from the rest of the world. Americans took more of an interest in religion and politics partly because so many settlers did come to America for religious freedom. They had an active part in government through their vote and community involvement. Most people today do not realize how unique this was when our country was formed. Yet today, one of the most common expressions among people is that they do not discuss religion or politics, two of the most important subjects relative to their future and the future of America. What happened between the time de Tocqueville visited America and today? We shall explain later in this book. It is problematic that de Tocqueville titled his book Democracy in America because although it is a lasting classic in American political literature, we are not a democracy. We are a republic. The title of his book has helped perpetuate the falsehood of American democracy, and when asked, most Americans today reply that our form of government is a democracy. When we stand and pledge allegiance to our flag, we refer to the republic for which it stands. The word democracy does not appear within the body of the Declaration of Independence or the Constitution, or in any of the constitutions of the 50 states. In fact, the Constitution mandates that every state government have a republican system. The schools no longer teach the difference between a republic and a democracy. They claim the two are the same, but emphasize democracy. Karl Marx stated in the Communist Manifesto that communists needed to, quote, win the battle for democracy, end quote. Some translations say win the battle of democracy. In any case, the communists advocate democracy, and many, too many anti-communists think that Marx was lying in an attempt to lure the reader into the idea that communists were Democrats. The truth be told, they are, at least until they gain control. A democracy is majority rule. A republic is the rule of law, governed by a constitution, and it cannot be changed without a supermajority desiring to do so. In every country, majorities have lorded it over minorities, whether racial, religious, or political. A true republic is formed to limit government and established to protect all citizens' rights, particularly those of individuals and minorities under an inviolate constitution. Let's limit the rights of Jews. All in favor say ja. In the Nazi German Reich, this was the new law leading ultimately to the death of Jews. This problem is not in the past. Over the last half-century, there have been many instances of the majority abusing the minority. In Rwanda, the majority Hutus slaughtered the Tutsis. In Southeast Asia, Rohingya Muslims have flooded into Bangladesh due to the majority Buddhists killing them and burning their homes. In country after country in the Middle East, majority sects of Muslims have killed minority sects of Muslims along with Christians and Jews over the past 30 years. Democracy is a very dangerous thing, and our country's founders knew this. The majority needs to be held in check from destroying the rights of minorities by law, a constitution that even limits the power of the government itself from limiting anyone's rights. President John Adams, in a letter to John Taylor in 1814, said, quote, "Democracy never lasts long. It soon wastes, exhausts, and murders itself. There was never democracy yet that did not commit suicide." End quote. When it comes to understanding the motivation behind the support for democracy by such men as Marx, the great writer and philosopher G.K. Chesterton understood the process. Quote, "You can never have a revolution in order to establish a democracy. You must have a democracy in order to have a revolution." End quote. The point is that knowing the difference between a republic, as we are, and a democracy is a layer of strength that has been eroded over the last century. Footnote. The best references for the differences between a republic and democracy are the DVD Overview of America, the booklet Republics and Democracies by Robert Welch, and Back to the Republic by Harry F. Atwood, Laird and Lee, Incorporated. Publisher Chicago, 1918. The latter is particularly recommended, but the former are easy to procure at www.jbs.org. Moving into change. Worth repeating is a purported quote by Franklin Delano Roosevelt, President of the United States from 1933 to 1945, since it is pertinent to understanding what has been and is going on. He said, quote, "In politics, nothing happens by accident. If it happens, you can bet it was planned that way." End quote. What we see happening is not by accident or ignorance. The movement toward socialism is deliberate, and in most cases, sold as security, safety, and helping those who cannot help themselves, altruism, etc. In other words, the labels applied to advance the cause of socialism have appealed to the better nature of the American people, who have not realized the long-range ramifications of allowing the federal government to involve itself in areas not specified by the Constitution. Horace Greeley, publisher of the New York Tribune and Karl Marx's employer in 1850, made the socialist program seem beneficial. Quote, "We believe that government, like every other intelligent agency, is bound to do good to the extent of its ability, that it ought actively to promote and increase the general well-being, that it should encourage and foster industry, science, invention, intellectual, social, and physical progress. Such is our idea of the sphere of government." End quote. This has been the siren song of all socialists. What many do not stop and think about is that first government must take away wealth, property, and even control from the individual in order to accomplish the above. This process alone gives the government inordinate power. Once the government starts down this path, government will decide what industry is, what science is, whether an invention should be pursued or utilized, what true intellectual pursuits are, and how we are to be organized socially. In other words, at the end of the road, if we're talking about government involvement in all of the above, it is totalitarianism, and whoever controls the government controls these endeavors and thus the people. With the socialists wanting this control by government, and all the while claiming it was for the people and a one-world government at the same time, the stage was set for gradual changes in American society leading away from a republic and the Constitution. Our constitutional republic was designed to protect the citizens' rights, not to take care of the citizens' problems. Furthermore, it is a cardinal rule of the socialists to form a one-world government. From the viewpoint of the socialists, if the government cannot achieve complete control over society and its citizens from within, then engaging in foreign entanglements can be used to force changes in our laws to accomplish the same thing by treaty, forcing us into an international system. We shall explore this problem as we proceed. We close out this chapter with a question. If you see an obvious solution to a problem but the politicians will not implement it, does this not tell you that the politicians are either ignorant, lazy, or want the problem to grow into a crisis in order to provide the excuse for a solution or agenda not yet revealed? Keep in mind, politicians are not stupid, or they would never have graduated from law school, for instance, or attained their political positions. If they do not solve problems, it means they have something else in mind. Chapter 2. History Unknown. Karl Marx is a name that conjures up either admiration or revulsion, depending on a person's political outlook. It is a name that is well recognized, but few have really looked into his background and, while doing so, asked some very important questions. Even those who have studied Marx more than others are not aware of the impact of the revolutionary movement of which Marx was a small part on United States politics and society long before there was an official Communist Party or even the International. Why is this important? Simply, the impact on American politics from the left and its influence on elitist structures goes back much further than people imagine. It did not start with the Franklin Delano Roosevelt or Woodrow Wilson administrations. These men were the products of a movement much older than Americans realize. The vast majority of Americans are not aware, for instance, that Karl Marx wrote for the New York Tribune for 11 years prior to and including the first year of the American Civil War. The Tribune at the time was the largest Sunday circulation newspaper in the United States. Marx was not the only European communist that wrote for the Tribune, and many on its editorial staff, as well as its publisher Horace Greeley, were part of the communist network in America at that time. Horace Greeley was very active in forming an organization that established nearly 50 communist communes across America at the time. Greeley, along with two other prominent political figures, including one in the Senate, joined the Communist First International shortly after it was formed. It was the communist/socialist organization that helped build the circulation of the Tribune. The Tribune's staff in turn played a major role in the establishment of the Republican Party in 1854 in the person of Alvin Beauvais, after a planning meeting with Greeley about building a new party. Beauvais worked for the Tribune for a time. The party was formed primarily out of the commune leadership that existed in Ripon, Wisconsin. This commune, known as the Ceresco, was part of the Greeley organization. If you know the right questions to ask, you will find this information on the internet. It was the socialist apparatus that propelled the rapid growth of the Republican Party to the extent that the Whigs faded away, and finally, politicians such as Lincoln joined the GOP in opposition to the Democrats months and years after it was founded. It is a myth that Lincoln was a founder of the Republican Party. He ran as a Whig for state office after the GOP was founded. There is not one person in 10,000 who knows these facts. The swamp is much older than people realize, and one has to look back to see its origins and how it gained control, particularly over history. While the name of Karl Marx was growing among the circle of socialists, he was not the leader until many years later. The name communist came into use about that time since the term socialist had come into disrepute. The opposite is the case today, when communist is considered worse than socialist. The publication of the Communist Manifesto helped propel the use of the term communism into the body of socialists of the day. For several years, neither Marx's nor Engels' name appeared on the title page of the Communist Manifesto as the author. They were not considered important enough at the time. The movement organization was more important, and this conspiracy avoided exposure as to its organization and leadership as well. Studying Marx's life, his slovenly habits, the shoddy treatment of his family, his bohemian lifestyle, always broke, his lack of responsibility for all of his obligations, etc., one would have to marvel that he was able to assume the leadership of the worldwide communist movement. Or did he? There is a great deal of evidence that he was simply a hack working for a force generally unobserved and helped along by unseen hands. This force has been referred to on many occasions, but the average citizen is never allowed to study it except to ridicule its existence. After all, everyone knows that to believe in conspiracy theories is the thinking of a Neanderthal, at least according to the mass media and liberal academics. Engels told the world that the communist organization had two levels, one open and one secret, a conspiracy. We quote a few lines from the article on the history of the Communist League by Frederick Engels. Quote, in 1836, the most extreme elements of the secret Democratic Republican Outlaws League split off and formed the new Secret League of the Just. The League was at that time actually not much more than the German branch of the French secret societies. End quote. Originally published November 12 through 26, 1885, in Sozialdemokrat, Marx and Engels Selected Works, Volume 3, Progress Publishers, Moscow, 1970. There is a great deal more regarding the secret organization, but we only quote the above to establish the fact that these people deal in secret societies and have an open agenda as well as a secret one that even the rank and file of their organization know little if anything about. Engels also mentioned the names of those who were the harbingers and wellspring of the movement, who were also second-generation Illuminati leaders. No one is allowed to think in terms of political conspiracy theories and be respected by the mass media, the mainstream Republican leaders, or anyone to the left of them. Yet it is interesting that nearly every federal case brought against someone includes the charge of conspiracy. The criminals engage in conspiracy. The mafia engages in conspiracy. The crooked financier engages in conspiracy. Even the cheating spouse engages in conspiracy. But we are led to believe that politicians do not, unless, of course, they are conservative politicians. The general population is not allowed to think of conspiracies even when historically the leaders of the conspiracy admit it. The idea, if it comes up, is that was then, this is now. No conspiracy. Don't look behind the curtain, Dorothy. Over the years, there have been many prominent men who have alluded to a conspiracy that exists in the body politic, but few have ever heard of these statements since they have been over the years systematically purged from the text studied in any level of academia. The list of witnesses is long, but just a few will suffice to demonstrate that there have been those who recognize that a political conspiracy exists. President Woodrow Wilson wrote, quote, some of the biggest men in the United States, in the field of commerce and manufacture, are afraid of somebody, are afraid of something. They know that there is a power somewhere so organized, so subtle, so watchful, so interlocked, so complete, so pervasive, that they had better not speak above their breath when they speak in condemnation of it. End quote. Woodrow Wilson, The New Freedom, New York, Doubleday, Page & Company, 1913, pages 13 and 14. Winston Churchill and Benjamin Disraeli, both of whom served as Prime Minister of Great Britain, also referred to this conspiracy. Disraeli twice mentioned things pertaining to this subject. First he wrote, quote, so you see, the world is governed by very different personages from what is imagined by those who are not behind the scenes. End quote. Coningsby, 1844. And, quote, the governments of the present day have to deal not merely with other governments, with emperors, kings, or ministers, but also with the secret societies which have everywhere their unscrupulous agents and can at the last moment upset all the government's plans. End quote. Speech at Aylesbury, Great Britain, September 10, 1876. A quote from Churchill gets closer to the truth of the matter. Quote, from the days of Spartacus Weishaupt, who founded the secret order of the Illuminati on May 1, 1776, to those of Karl Marx, this worldwide conspiracy for the overthrow of civilization and for the reconstitution of society on the basis of arrested development, of envious malevolence, and impossible equality has been steadily growing. It played a definitely recognizable part in the tragedy of the French Revolution. It has been the mainspring of every subversive movement during the 19th century. End quote. Zionism versus Bolshevism. Illustrated Sunday Herald, London, February 8, 1920. Any student of politics who ignores the existence of the Illuminati does himself a great disservice. There are many historical and political pundits who dismiss the influence and continuation of this organization. However, the existence of the Illuminati is a fact. The debate is over how powerful they were and when or if they dissolved. The denial of the influence of the Illuminati is enough of a problem in Europe, but is almost absolute in the United States among establishment historians, for reasons we shall explore further on. One of the key organizations run by perhaps the most important member of the Illuminati in revolutionary France, Nicolas Bonneville, was the Cercle Social, or Social Circle. It served as an activist think tank regarding how to subvert any society and promote Illuminism. Illuminism has two main tenets that have influenced both their existence and that of those who can trace their origins to them: the elimination of God and the building of a one-world government, to be run by them. There are many issues that come to bear to achieve these goals, but they all distill down to these two. Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels referred to the social circle in their book The Holy Family, published in February 1845, 3 years prior to the Communist Manifesto. Quote, "The revolutionary movement which began in 1789 in the Cercle Social gave rise to the communist idea, reintroduced in France after the Revolution of 1830. This is the idea of the New World Order." End quote. That is the communist idea of a New World Order. This was not a new concept in 1845, but demonstrated that communism came out of the Cercle Social of revolutionary France and tells us a great deal about the beginnings of the communist movement and the idea of a New World Order. Out of the Cercle Social came a number of movements that coalesced into what became known as National Socialism, Nazism, and Communism. There were other movements it spawned, but we will confine the narrative to these two for the moment. The differences between Nazism and communism were very subtle, with the primary difference being which method is best to use to subvert any particular country and who should lead these movements, one group wanting to rule versus another leadership team. In many cases, the only visible difference was the color of the uniforms worn by their followers. More often than not, fascism or Nazism was used to appear to be the enemy of the communists, even though there was very little difference other than style. In fact, both Hitler and Mussolini, the two most notorious fascists, were very much involved in communist movements prior to becoming fascists. These facts have been scrubbed from their biographies that have been presented to the people. In essence, the same force spawned both movements, and there is considerable evidence that this force was controlling both at the same time behind the scenes. They were used to make it appear as if they were two different alternatives, when in reality, they were the same. Both eliminated God, and both advocated a new world order. False alternatives have always been used by the sinister forces that came out of the Illuminati. As a result, these false alternative solutions offered for an identified problem have all been evil or detrimental to liberty for the people, and all of them grew the power of government. This will become more apparent as we progress in our narrative. The idea of fascism being an alternative to communism is a blatant example of this tactic of using false alternatives or solutions. Always remember that the lesser of two evils is still evil. The history of the rivalry between the Nazis and the communists has many surprising twists and turns. One of these was when the Nazis won the streets of Germany in street brawls against the communists in the 1930s. Then upon defeat, the communist thugs simply joined the ranks of the Nazi brown shirts. They became known among the German people as beefsteak Nazis, brown on the outside, red on the inside. No matter who wins, the Nazi or the communist, the people lose. The same is true if we evolve into the New World Order under any other banner. Ultimately, the people lose. The term New World Order has a double meaning. In George Orwell's famous novel 1984, the anti-hero Winston Smith is a member of the ruling totalitarian party. At one point, he learns that his political party does not really run things as it seems on the surface. The rule actually comes from a secret entity higher up called the Inner Party that rules the entire world. They act as if they are enemies from region to region of the earth, But this is only a ruse to keep the people in check. The inner party learned that during a time of war, the citizens will put up with nearly anything done by their government in the name of the war effort. So they started wars and kept wars going in order to subjugate their own people, but at the top, all the countries were ruled by the same entity. At the top, they were all of one mind and controlled the entire globe, even as they waged wars against one another. It is not unlike the mafia dividing up territory in Chicago or New York into small criminal fiefdoms. Each has a part of the city and answers to a higher mafia chief, even though they will war against one another for territory in particular segments of the criminal activity. This world inner party is referred to as the New World Order. So the New World Order, NWO, can mean either the one world government or the group, or order, that wants to establish and rule the one world government. It almost always refers to the world government goal, but subtleties in some writings by their minions hint that they are talking about the organization rather than the structure they mean to establish as a world government. George Orwell, Arthur Blair was his real name, knew the plans of the communist movement since he worked with them for some time until he broke with them. What he learned he put into his novels 1984 and Animal Farm, both of which became international bestsellers. As we have established, Marx and Engels said that the NWO was the communist idea. It is the socialist idea as well, since all socialists look to Karl Marx as their patriarch and claim to spring from the mind of Marx. The idea of a one-world government is also the idea of an elitist group who finance and control the lower rank and file of the socialist/communist movement. In most instances, the rank-and-file members have no idea that those they supposedly oppose and attack in their publications might just be their true covert bosses, not the visible heads of their party or movement. An important book was published in 1970 by W. Cleon Skousen, titled The Naked Capitalist. It was in part a sequel to his very popular The Naked Communist. It was in fact a review of another important book, Tragedy and Hope, an expose of the elite structure in the United States by Carroll Quigley, a professor at Georgetown University who cooperated with them his entire adult life. Quigley claimed that he was allowed to research the papers of the organization behind such groups as the CFR to work on his book, and only disagreed with their wanting to remain anonymous when he felt they should have been more open. This demonstrates a bit of naivete on the part of Quigley as to how those behind the curtain work, and why. Those who mean to move the people in a direction desired by an elitist organization never want themselves to be exposed. Skousen was a former FBI agent and chief of police in Salt Lake City. The Naked Capitalist began thus, quote, "I think the communist conspiracy is merely a branch of a much bigger conspiracy. The above statement was made to this reviewer several years ago by Dr. Bella Dodd, a former member of the National Committee of the U.S. Communist Party. Dr. Dodd said she first became aware of some mysterious super leadership right after World War II when the U.S. Communist Party had difficulty getting instructions from Moscow on several vital matters requiring immediate attention. The American communist hierarchy was told that any time they had an emergency of this kind, they should contact any one of 3 designated persons at the Waldorf Towers. Dr. Dodd noted that whenever the party obtained instructions from any of these 3 men, Moscow always ratified them. What puzzled Dr. Dodd was the fact that not one of these 3 contacts was a Russian, nor were any of them communists. In fact, all 3 were extremely wealthy American capitalists. Dr. Dodd said, quote, "I would certainly like to find out who was really running things," end quote. Who these 3 gentlemen were was not revealed. It is a mistaken belief that wealthy capitalists are all opposed to communism. It is a trap to believe that the political argument is about money and who owns what, even though both are used to gain the conspiracy's goals. The real issue is who holds the power. It is about the accumulation of power that counts, not property and money per se. These commodities are only a means to an end for the politically ambitious, the accumulation of power. As we have pointed out before, control of property is more important than ownership. Likewise with the use of money. Ultimate control is exercised by government unless that government is limited under the law, such as by a constitution that is adhered to as written. We know that in all communist countries some are more equal than others, having vacation dachas out of sight of the Russian masses or billionaire Chinese working within the communist hierarchy. Castro may have worn khakis in public, but he lived like a king. The same for Saddam Hussein. Hitler, Stalin, and Mao Zedong were not rich. They came up from the streets. Once they held power, they didn't need money or property. They could have anything they wanted. Again, it is not money or property. It is power. Let us give an example of control, or power versus money. In relationship to their wealth, the Rockefellers own next to nothing, yet they control vast empires. Most, if not all, of their assets are the property of their various foundations and trusts. As long as they control the trustee boards, they use the wealth and property as if it were their own. In the case of the socialist movement of all stripes, it goes beyond simple power and becomes an extremely perverted form of power wherein those who are the powerful delight in not only subjugating the people, but having people tortured and killed in large numbers, not always out of the sight of the mass of people they rule, an activity used to intimidate the masses into submission. In the case of the Nazi hierarchy in Germany, they not only killed millions, at the same time they dabbled in occult and satanic activities, which have been well documented. Let us state, since we have just given an example, power versus money, that most arguments surrounding an issue are structured to miss the vital point. The people are channeled into arguing over minor points compared to what they should be discussing. In the example above, people are led to think that money and property are the key issues in the accumulation of power. Another false assumption is that jobs and the economy are the primary issues concerning trade, when in fact, trade agreements have more to do with surrendering our national sovereignty to international commissions, courts, etc., which in the long run will destroy American independence. Just as the main issues are not obvious in some arguments, there are forces at work that are not readily apparent at first glance, but with a little research can be at least partially exposed. Another tactic of deflecting notice is for the secret forces behind the scenes, once exposed, to dive down under the surface even more and resurface later under a different name and ostensible leadership. Yet it is the same organization and leadership under a different name and titular leaders. A good example of the wealthy and powerful helping the street organizers of the socialists is the help given to Saul Alinsky by George Romney. Alinsky wrote the book Rules for Radicals with a dedication to Lucifer. This book outlined how the radical socialists could organize community action groups to further their agenda. Romney helped Alinsky by raising money for him, and this fact can be verified online without any doubt. Likewise, the National Teachers Association recommends the book to be read by its teacher members. We shall delve into what has happened over the past century to so alter our country as to comfortably merge it into the New World Order, and more importantly, who has been doing it. We will concentrate more on the organization called the Council on Foreign Relations, CFR, but there are other such groups involved in the United States with links to similar groups internationally. Karl Marx wrote over 500 articles for the New York Tribune after he wrote the Communist Manifesto. It is doubtful that Greeley did not know the subversive nature of Marx when he hired him. After all, Greeley was an important leader of the American branch of the communist movement. On the other hand, most did not know Marx had a hand in writing the manifesto because it was originally published as a party organ and did not list the authors. For many years, Marx was not well recognized as a leader outside of the small inner circle of the communist movement. The forces behind the communist movement had not yet recognized Marx's ability to represent what would become one of the most important fingers on the conspiratorial hand: communism. The communist movement displayed a dog-eat-dog behavior within the leadership for several years until Marx reached the philosophical apex of the movement. This type of behavior continued on through the years and has been a hallmark of the leaders of socialist and communist organizations. They constantly quarrel and vie to be the leader. This is allowed as long as the real motivation behind their movement is not exposed by their infighting. The leaders were and are essentially criminals who behave no differently than criminals. They not only want to rule the masses, they also want to rule over each other and fight for the leadership, sometimes very violently. This has been especially true in Europe and Asia. Two European examples are the fight between Hitler and Ernst Röhm, leader of the Brown Shirts, and Stalin versus Trotsky. Hitler killed Röhm and Stalin killed Trotsky since they were a threat to their leadership. In both cases, in the beginning, the murdered person was higher in the pecking order of the movement than the murderer. In China, the fight among communist leaders for power was constant even after Mao Zedong died. In some cases, this extended throughout China with the elimination of Central Committee members of the Communist Party as well as intellectuals. Another European communist who wrote for the New York Tribune before the Civil War was Heinrich Bornstein. He immigrated to the United States where he formed the Society of Free Men as a framework for education and anti-Christian agitation while remaining active in the newspaper business. Since the Tribune was the largest Sunday circulated newspaper in America, its authors, such as Bornstein, as well as American socialists who also worked for the paper, had a considerable influence on our country. At the same time, the Tribune was not the only newspaper run by socialists, and together The papers built the reputation of certain American politicians and literati among their readers while attacking those who wished to maintain the Republic and the original intent of the Constitution. There was an even larger influence prior to the Civil War, which not only gained a foothold in American society, but became ingrained into American politics after the war. In 1848 and 1849, Europe was embroiled in civil unrest, which became known as the Democratic Revolutions. These so-called Democrats gradually failed in their revolutionary aims. Rather than be placed in jail or worse, thousands of these revolutionaries fled to the United States, particularly their leaders. The few leaders that did not flee across the sea migrated to Britain or Belgium. This migration of revolutionaries is documented in this author's tome, To the Victor Go the Myths and Monuments. The short story is that these democratic revolutions were more often than not led by members of the communist movement. In fact, the Communist Manifesto by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels was written and published as a guide for these revolutionaries just months before the revolutions in 1848. The book was a tool to be used in the planned international revolutions in Europe. In other words, these were not spontaneous revolutions, but well-planned events with such tools as the manifesto prepared for the revolutionaries to try to enlist as many people as possible into their scheme. When the communist movement failed to overthrow several governments in Europe, many of their leaders and minions came to America, where they began to ingratiate themselves into American society and politics. This had a profound effect on the future of the American people. None of this history is contained in the history books used to educate American students at any academic level. It has become hidden history, so hidden that few people can accept these facts when first encountering them. Without expounding on the details, these particular immigrants had a profound effect on the American Civil War and gained considerable stature within our political, educational, and media centers by the 1870s. So much so that many became prominent in their fields. Few could believe that they were ever communists as they softened their approach and honed their skills of persuasion. Over time, certain American moguls and academics became influenced by this movement because they were educated in German universities that retained professors on the left and even members of the Illuminati. In some instances, these American students returned to the United States to foster secret societies, quote-unquote, progressive organizations, and political movements, academic institutions, historical societies, and international banking. In all of this, the primary goal of a one-world government remained. This goal was often couched in acceptable words and arguments promoting peace and universal brotherhood, and as such, it often found a place within American Christian churches. It all sounded beneficial except for one thing. Power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Keeping this in mind, a centralized one-world government would in and of itself, no matter the origins, no matter the structure, no matter the mission, become corrupt. The individual citizen would become irrelevant and powerless to determine his own life, employment, business, education, etc. A corrupt, powerful state would eventually determine these things for him, especially if the state was built by socialists in the first place. As we have determined, this state is known as the New World Order, a term used by many world leaders as the goal they wish to achieve. An entire book could be published with the statements of such people as George H.W. Bush, Henry Kissinger, Fidel Castro, Mikhail Gorbachev, etc., concerning their desire to see a New World Order and using those exact words. To include the various statements by a variety of governments and their organs, newspapers, media, etc., saying the same thing would also require a book. In almost every case, the leaders who used this term were communists, socialists, fascists, or members of elite organizations whose common goal was a one-world government. One method the reader may use to access this information is to go online to YouTube or any search engine and type in, quote, New World Order to see just how many have stated their desire for an NWO in videos or print. In the case of President George H.W. Bush, it is a considerable amount. With the influx of more and more immigrants into the United States during the 1800s, the American culture was moving more and more away from the American society that formed this country. The massive immigration of the 1850s created a change that accelerated even more as a result of the large influx straddling the year 1900. These immigrants were not educated in Americanism, but looked more to government as a result of their upbringing in Europe. True, many did not like the idea of a king, but did not abandon the concept of government doing more than it should for the citizen. By the elections of 1912 and 1914, a drastic modification in the federal government was the result. We will discuss these issues later, but as a consequence, the government changed the Constitution with 2 amendments that altered the very nature of government. And at the same time, Congress created the Federal Reserve. In the election of 1912, the candidates for president were all socialists of some stripe or another. They were Woodrow Wilson, Theodore Roosevelt, William H. Taft, and Eugene V. Debs. Eugene V. Debs was the head of the Socialist Party. He was the obvious socialist and received nearly 1 million votes, which would be the equivalent of 4 million if the vote were today. Theodore Roosevelt was the candidate of the Progressive Party, the term progressive long being a euphemism for socialist. If the reader doubts Roosevelt's socialist leanings, they should access and read his speech at the dedication of the John Brown Memorial Park, Osawatomie, Kansas, on August 31, 1910, known as the New Nationalism speech. William Howard Taft was the son of a founder of the secret Skull and Bone Society at Yale and became a member as well. This society has a history of its members' involvement in internationalism to the detriment of American independence and sovereignty. This secret society is so important that we shall expand on its existence later. Taft was instrumental in the formation of the League to Enforce the Peace in 1915, an American forerunner of the League of Nations, which was formed about 5 years later. It was an attempt to involve the American government in an entangling alliance where international structures would control our military. Woodrow Wilson has a reputation that belies his socialist and internationalist activities. There are several books that document his desire to engage America in World War I early in the war, all the while lying to the American people about his true intent. They also document his desire to form a one-world government through the entity called the League of Nations. This organization would have tied the hands of the American government in international negotiations and would have meant the loss of independence on several levels of activity, not the least of which is our ability to declare or not to declare war. The Senate of the United States understood this problem in 1919, but forgot it in 1945 when they ratified the United Nations Charter. Much more history could be recounted that relates some of the reasons the American march toward socialism and one-world government was happening. But we believe that enough has been documented to give the reader an idea of what was going on. An in-depth look at the situation is contained in the book To the Victor Go the Myths and Monuments. We move now to more specifics that have changed the American landscape that we still have to deal with today.